We are back with 24 Then and Now, our series looking at UVM in 1924 through the lens of 4 student scrapbooks from the time. In this episode, we're going to step back and contextualize these scrapbooks a little bit, and in 1924 as a whole, with our friend Chris Burns from the Silver Special Collections Library. We want to understand what life was like then to better understand it today. What was America like in the 20s? What was Vermont like? And most importantly, what was UVM like? So I'm going to head inside and tell you a lot more about it. First, a quick content warning. This episode does deal with issues of racism, ableism, and eugenics. Okay, let's dive in.
It's an interesting era, and it's a really interesting era to compare with our own, right? Because in some respects, we're coming out of a similar kind of worldwide traumatic events in terms of our COVID pandemic and where our students are at, and in terms back then of coming out of World War I and the Spanish flu, which was the last sort of global pandemic at that scale. So, you know, I think people are adjusting to what life is like again.
America in the 1920s was booming. Hemlines came up, short hair was in, smoking was seen as a sign of independence, the economy was roaring, and so were the parties. Until the economic crash of 1929 that would spawn the Great Depression, the Roaring Twenties presented us with abundance and fast-paced change.
The automobile is becoming more prevalent.
Still, most Vermonters relied on trains, horses, and carriages. Vermont roads were largely dirt. Students at UVM had the unique advantage of being close to the Canadian border. A few students with access to a car could hop over to Gallagher's and have a beer with dinner, which would have been illegal on the Vermont side. Campus looked different too. A lot more fields, dirt roads, a lot less buildings, a lot less students too. In terms of enrollment, in the academic year from 1923 to 1924, UVM had 691 male students and 469 female students, for a total of 1,160 students. The 1924 class came from 14 U.S. states, primarily from Vermont, New York, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. But on campus at the time were also 3 international students, from China, Newfoundland, and Panama. The current graduating class of 2024 hails from all 50 states and 77 countries outside the U.S., and is predominantly female identifying. But women on campus began around World War I. With men overseas, women held down the home front, and some enrolled in college. With that came an increase in teacher certification programs, as well as majors that aligned with gender norms, like home economics and secretarial studies.
There's this paternalistic streak of them needing more protection. Mm-hmm. So I think you see Grassmount as part of the women's campus at first, and then you start to see the Buell Estate, which becomes Redstone, and then Redstone becomes the women's campus right in the early 20s, so right in this era. So you have a women's campus where they were living and where they were dining.
While the men were gone, women had a chance to reevaluate their roles in society. With the suffragette movement, white women gained the right to vote in 1920.
Things are kind of rapidly changing in big ways.
1920 is also the year the nation heard its first commercial radio broadcast, conducted by Pittsburgh-based station KDKA.
This is KDKA of the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company in East Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
In 1921, Edna Beard becomes Vermont's first woman to serve as a legislator, holding seat 146 in the House of Representatives. But she wasn't the only Vermonter making headlines. On August 3, 1923, Calvin Coolidge, then Vice President of the United States, was awakened in the middle of the night at his Plymouth family home and vested as the country's 30th President of the United States, following the death of Warren G. Harding. Coolidge's own father, a notary public, administered his son's oath of office. At the time, Guy Bailey was only in year 3 out of his eventual 20 years serving as president of UVM.
Guy Bailey himself has a pretty complex history at UVM. And we didn't talk about it, sort of, this being the era of the eugenics survey, sort of really coming into its own and being very well supported by UVM and Bailey's role in that and Henry Perkins' role in that. But, I think that's become one of the ways people think about Guy Bailey now.
Students of 1924 were tremendously supportive of Guy Bailey. He worked hard to bring in scholarships, but after his death in 1940, it became clear he'd left the university in a financial deficit of about $500,000. He'd also furthered the efforts of Professor Henry Perkins and Perkins' Vermont Eugenics Survey, which held white supremacy at its core. White supremacy was rampant across the nation at the time. With the 1915 film Birth of a Nation, the Ku Klux Klan experienced a second wave and recruited across the country, including in Vermont. Prohibition helped the KKK thrive.
Prohibition is big in this period. 1920, the federal prohibition passes. Vermont had had a longer history with prohibition, but it was sort of more local option at that point, which meant towns could make their own decisions on prohibition. But then the federal prohibition comes in at 1920, and it's just true for everyone.
The KKK positioned themselves as an extension of the law. They targeted Catholic, Black, and immigrant communities in the name of enforcing prohibition as a vigilante police group. Like eugenics sought to purify the gene pool, the KKK's aim was to purify the country of minorities and immigrants. Racism shows up on campus too. The highlight of the Winter Festival until the late 1960s was something called Cakewalk, a tradition lasting 73 years at UVM. It featured minstrel shows that perpetuated racial stereotypes, including blackface and satin tuxedos, all of which caused staggering harm. But there were also lots of good things happening at the time. In 1924, UVM's College of Medicine graduates Dorothy Lang, a native Vermonter and the first woman to earn her MD from the University of Vermont. 6 years later, in 1930, Edna Hall Brown becomes the first recorded Black woman to graduate from UVM. She received her Bachelor of Science in Education, nearly 100 years after the first Black graduate, Andrew Harris, who graduated in 1838.
As much as things have changed quite a bit since then, there is so much that's really still kind of common to a student experience. You're still kind of taking that next leap in your life. You're learning all these big ideas. The curriculum certainly changed, but a lot of it's pretty similar. Getting exposure to a range of ideas and helping students figure out what they want to do next in life. That piece feels very similar, as well as, while maybe the particular social activities have changed a little bit, it still is very much a social environment, right, of meeting new friends. In many cases, they become sort of the lifelong friends, making new connections and doing activities as a group. Yeah.
Thanks so much for watching. Next time, we'll be doing food and dining on campus, so stay tuned.